Dr. Ira Helfand found someone to cover his work shifts so that he could join us today in Madison. He was also at Carroll College last night in Waukesha and spoke to 150 people there. And he had a very full schedule today as well. He's one of the world's most indefatigable and knowledgeable speakers on the dangers of nuclear war. He speaks both to the medical and long-term climate effects of nuclear war. He's also a member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It's also known as ICAN. He's on their steering committee, and some of you may know that they were the recipient of the Nobel Prize this last fall. He's also co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and has been the past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Ira played a critical role in the passage of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017, and we feel very fortunate to have him with us tonight. So thank you, Ira.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm sure you are all aware, before I start speaking, that the things I'm going to talk about are not very pleasant to listen to. And so I appreciate your being willing to take an evening and talk about these things. As I often tell audiences, I think we have two choices. We can either talk about nuclear war and do something about it, or we can experience nuclear war. And given the two, clearly talking about it is the lesser of those two evils. How many of you have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington? There's an exhibit there which really haunts me. Those of you who've been there know that there are all kinds of exhibits about the victims, what happened to people, what the camps were like, how horrible it was. But the exhibit that always troubles me the most is quite different from those. I haven't seen it in about 20 years, but my recollection of it is that it's a group of photographs that were taken by the residents of one small Jewish town in Poland. About 3,000 people in the town. 90% of them were killed 2 or 3 years after these photographs were taken. And I think they're displayed on a corridor as you're walking from one exhibit to another. They're just on the walls. And they're pictures of everyday life. They're people, at football games, people in beer gardens, people at graduation parties, the kinds of things we would take on our cell phones today. And what's striking is looking at these pictures, you know that these people could not imagine that their world was about to disappear. And they had an inkling. They knew what was going on next door in Germany, but they could not bring themselves to think that they and everyone they loved and everything that they loved was going to be destroyed. And what haunts me is my fear that these are pictures of us, that this is the situation that we're in today. We all know that there's this terrible threat of nuclear war, but we don't really think it's going to happen. And so we don't do what we need to do to prevent it from happening. Back in the 1980s, when many of us first became active on this issue, everyone understood and believed that nuclear war could take place, and that if it did, it would destroy everything. And as a result of that knowledge, that understanding, millions of people took action. We built a movement in this country, in Europe, even in the Soviet Union, that led to mass demonstrations, a mass educational effort, thousands of people sitting down and teaching themselves about nuclear war and then going out and teaching their friends and neighbors about it. And as a result of that political activity, we changed the course of history. The US and the Soviet Union were engaged in an arms race. They were building 3,000 more warheads every year. They were racing towards a nuclear confrontation. The Reagan administration came into office, pledged to developing the ability to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. And it built and deployed weapons to be able to do just that. We were really heading for Armageddon. And through the incredible political and educational activity that thousands of people took part in, all that was changed. In January of 1981, when he came to office, Ronald Reagan pledged to be able to fight and win nuclear war in Europe. 3 years later, in his State of the Union address, he said that nuclear war could never be won and must never be fought. And at the time, the change in his policy was so abrupt and so profound that most of us missed it. I mean, we literally thought this was just campaign rhetoric for the 1984 presidential election, but it wasn't. We had changed his thinking about nuclear weapons. We had taught him and his administration that indeed nuclear war can't be won and should never be fought. And it was an extraordinary accomplishment. It ended the Cold War arms race, and I believe it is fair to say that it saved the world, because absent that political activity, I think we would have gone on to a nuclear war. Then the Cold War ended, happily, wonderful development. But as an unanticipated consequence of the end of the Cold War, we all stopped thinking about nuclear weapons. The weapons didn't go away. Many of them were taken apart, but there were thousands left. But we all started to act as if the whole problem had gone away. And it didn't. For the next 25, maybe 20 years after the end of the Cold War, we kind of existed in that uneasy state. The weapons were still here. Relations between the US and Russia were pretty good. There were no real big conflicts in the world that were likely to lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And we all got kind of comfortable with the idea that it was okay for these weapons to still exist. But over the last 5 years, that's changed too. And it is clear now that the danger of nuclear war is growing, that it's greater than it's been at any time since the end of the Cold War, and that it may, in fact, as William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, has argued, it may, in fact, be greater than it was during the Cold War. I think there are a number of factors that have led to this new and dangerous situation that we're in. There are 4 geographic, geopolitical conflicts, and then there are 3 other factors that we need to think about. So 7 factors in all that have created this sort of perfect storm of danger. First, there are relations between the United States and Russia, which are at the worst point they have been since the end of the Cold War. And we all believed when the Cold War ended that we had dodged that bullet, that we never had to worry about great power nuclear war again. And it is totally clear that that sense of security was not well placed. Events in Ukraine, events in Syria, the hacking of our election last year, all of these things indicate that there is real conflict potential between the United States and Russia, and that conflict, should it occur, could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. Secondly, there are US relations with China. They're at the worst point they've been in 40 years. During much of the 80s, China was essentially an ally of the United States in the final stages of the Cold War, and in the period since then, we've had a pretty warm relationship. That's changed dramatically in the last few years. In addition to all the trade issues, the US and Chinese Navy now frequently play chicken in the South China Sea. This extremely dangerous and irresponsible attempt to assert who's got control over these little islands that really don't amount to a whole lot. But this game of chicken could at some point, more likely through accident than through intention, escalate into some kind of a conflict that could lead to nuclear war. The third geopolitical situation, of course, is North Korea, the one that we're all so obsessed with, and appropriately so at this time. And I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but clearly the danger of war in Korea is very great. Observers are saying we are closer to nuclear war right now, at this moment, because of this situation, than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And while we welcome the idea that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump will sit down and try to negotiate a solution to this crisis, I think most of us also fear that these negotiations are not well prepared for, that the people entering into them are not really entering into them with a common understanding of how they should conclude, and there's a very high likelihood that they will fail. And if they fail, that failure may indeed be used as the pretext for military action by the United States against Korea. The fourth geopolitical area is one which gets almost no attention here in the United States, but which I think is every bit as dangerous, and perhaps even more so, and that's the conflict between India and Pakistan and South Asia. They have fought 4 wars since independence in 1946. There is fighting almost every day on the border between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. There are terrorist groups in Pakistan which have attacked India in the past and may attack India again in the future. And I think no one who follows events there closely would be at all surprised to wake up tomorrow and learn that either the fighting in Kashmir had escalated, or perhaps there had been another terrorist attack of the type that India has said will be met with a military response. Now, this situation is particularly dangerous because both countries have made it clear that if there is a fifth war, it will be a nuclear war. India has a much stronger conventional military than Pakistan, and in response to that, Pakistan has developed a nuclear policy which calls for them to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield early on, as soon as Indian forces cross the border into Pakistan. And in response to that, India has said that if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons, even small weapons on the battlefield, India will retaliate by attacking Pakistani cities. And it will escalate further from there. And so this is an incredibly dangerous situation, totally ignored by the US public, I think largely ignored by the US government as well, very unstable and something which could explode into a catastrophe at any time, tonight, tomorrow, whenever. In addition to those four geopolitical situations, there are three other factors that we need to consider. The first is the danger of nuclear cyber terrorism. We used to think that the great danger that terrorists pose with regards to nuclear weapons was that they could get hold of a single, probably small, Hiroshima-sized nuclear device and use it to blow up New York or London or Moscow. What we are now told is that the greater danger is that terrorists could hack into the command and control systems of the United States or Russia or China and either directly cause the launch of that country's nuclear weapons, or perhaps more likely, create a false alert. Make the country that is being hacked believe that it is the victim of an ongoing nuclear attack so that it would launch its weapons in retaliation. And it is very hard to know how we can protect against this as long as our weapons remain on hair-trigger alert and in a position where they can be launched by a simple press of the button. There is obviously a large cybersecurity industry, but despite that, the Pentagon computer systems get hacked into on a regular basis, and we know that. And we don't know when some terrorist is going to get clever enough to figure out how to carry out this kind of cyber attack. The next thing that we need to consider is climate change, which is making the chance of nuclear war greater. The US and the other nuclear weapons states have said for a long time that they favor the ultimate abolition of nuclear weapons, but the time isn't right. It's too dangerous right now. We have to wait until the world is a safer place. The problem is the world is not going to be a safer place. As climate change progresses, and it will, even if we do all the things that we're supposed to do to try to stop the process from going forward, as climate change progresses, there are going to be incredible stresses on countries, on communities all around the world. Large parts of the planet are going to become essentially uninhabitable. And the populations living there are going to have to go someplace. And we're going to see migrations on a scale that absolutely dwarf the crisis that overwhelmed Europe 2 years ago. And as that vast forced migration takes place, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be intersocietal conflict, there's going to be interstate conflict. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table, especially again in South Asia, those weapons are going to get used. And seventh, the final factor which is increasing the nuclear danger is something which I hope is going to be a more transient phenomenon, but it is a very real problem at the moment, and that is the Trump presidency. And I'm always somewhat conflicted about discussing this issue because I think this should be viewed always through a nonpartisan lens. And I would argue that my statements about President Trump are not partisan in nature. The impetus for this analysis comes from people in his own party, security experts in his own party, who have judged him, whatever they think about his other policies, to be lacking in the judgment, the temperament, and the knowledge base required for someone who is in command of a nuclear arsenal. The United States has said for decades that it would be a disaster if even a single nuclear weapon fell into the wrong hands, by which we meant a rogue state like North Korea or a terrorist group. But we have turned over 6,800 nuclear warheads to this man who I believe is not the wisest person to be in charge of a nuclear arsenal. And I think, many Republican members of the Congress share this assessment. They have said so publicly. This is not a partisan attack on the president. It is a simple statement of the assessment of the security community in this country at this time, on both sides of the political aisle. We have a problem when someone this unstable, this mercurial, is in charge of nuclear weapons. So, with all of these factors in play, and with the danger of nuclear war greater than it's been since the end of the Cold War, what are we talking about if these weapons actually get used? What would a nuclear war look like? Let me start by describing first a limited nuclear war. We used to think that we just had to worry, from a global perspective, about a big war between the United States and Russia. But we now understand, through studies that have been done over the last 10, 12 years, that even a very limited use of nuclear weapons, as might take place between India and Pakistan, would be a disaster not just for those countries, but for the entire planet. We've looked at a specific scenario in which India and Pakistan each attack each other with 50 Hiroshima-sized bombs. This is a small part of their arsenal. Each of these countries now has 130 weapons, many of which are 2 to 3 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. Some may be as much as 10 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. But the study was done using this more limited scenario. What was found was that if these two countries deploy a total of 100 Hiroshima bombs on urban industrial targets in the other countries, 20 million people would die in the first week from the explosions, the fires, and the short-term radiation effects. And to put that in perspective, during all of World War II, across the whole planet over 8 years, 50 million people died. So we would have a World War II-like event unfolding in one corner of the planet over the course of just a week's time. But as catastrophic as these effects in South Asia, these local effects would be, they're only part of the story. The 100 firestorms started by these 100 nuclear warheads would loft about 6.5 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. And that would block out the sun, dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 1.3 degrees centigrade. The cooler air would absorb less water from the ocean to fall back as precipitation, so precipitation would decline as well. And as a result of this cooling and drying of the planet, which would take place very quickly over the course of a few days, but last for 2 to 3 decades, as a result of this climate disruption, food production around the world would fall catastrophically. And a study published by PSR and IPPNW has concluded that up to 2 billion people worldwide could starve to death as a result of this limited nuclear war. The death of 2 billion people over the course of a decade, should that happen, would be an event unprecedented in human history. It would not be the extinction of our species, but it would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude. And the very complex, fragile economic system which we all depend on would not fare any better than previous civilizations have done. That's a limited nuclear war. That's a little war, less than 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenals, taking place between 2 of the smaller nuclear powers, out of our control, and for the most part, out of our mind and our thoughts. What happens if there's a big nuclear war? Let me describe to you what a modern attack on a large city would look like. Most of us have images in our minds of Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the bombings there. And those images are a very powerful warning of what nuclear weapons can do. But the most important thing we need to know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if nuclear weapons are used by the United States or Russia in a large-scale nuclear war. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either country. I have learned recently that the United States still targets Moscow with over 100 nuclear warheads, and that doesn't count the warheads in the British, French, and Chinese arsenals that are also targeted on Moscow. The model that we use to look at a modern attack is based on a smaller number. We assume that New York or Washington or London or Moscow is probably targeted with at least 15 to 20 warheads, but as I said, this may be a significant underestimate. And we expect that each of these weapons is in the range of 30 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. To describe this, we use a model of a single 20 megaton explosion. That's 1,700 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It actually underestimates the damage that would be done by 15 smaller weapons spread out more efficiently over a large area. But it gives an adequate approximation of what this attack would look like. Within 1/1000th of a second, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, the temperature would rise to 20 million degrees, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour and blast pressures greater than 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that people build. Underground shelters collapse when they're exposed to these kinds of overpressures. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, wood, cloth, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York City, we're talking about something like 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this same level of destruction would be visited on every major city in both countries. And if NATO were drawn into the conflict, most of the cities in Canada and Europe as well. All told, perhaps 300 to 500 million people dead in a day. But again, as horrible as these local effects are, they're only part of the story. Limited war in South Asia put 6.5 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere. A war between the United States and Russia, fought today with the weapons still deployed under the New START Treaty, that war puts 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. And that drops temperatures across the planet not 1.3 degrees centigrade, but 8 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop by 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And what we would effectively do is to create our own ice age in a matter of days. In the Northern Hemisphere, there would be 3 years without a single day free of frost. The temperature would go below freezing at least some portion of every single day. And under those conditions, all of the ecosystems that have evolved in the last 12,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, they'd all collapse. These are not the conditions which they have evolved to live in. Most food production across the entire planet would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death. And under these conditions, it is possible that we would become extinct as a species. Now, this is not some scenario cooked up for a grade B movie. This is the danger that we are living with and will continue to live with every single day as long as these weapons exist. And we ignore it. And we ignore it at our peril. This is the future that will be if we don't take action. But it's not the future that has to be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. They're not an act of God. They are not something that is out of our control. We built these weapons with our own hands, and we know how to take them apart. We have already disassembled 50,000 warheads since the height of the Cold War. Things were even crazier then. But we didn't make the decision to get rid of the last 15,000. And that's what has to change. That's where we need to come into the picture. Fortunately, in the last couple of years, there has been a vibrant international movement growing to end this situation. led at the civil society level by ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and at the government level by a group of non-nuclear weapon states that are committed to truly securing a world free of nuclear weapons. This movement culminated last summer on July 7th with the adoption at the United Nations by a vote of 122 to 1 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty which outlaws the possession, the creation, the deployment, the transportation, the financing of nuclear weapons. And it is a huge achievement, and I think a landmark development in the path towards a nuclear-free future. But there's a big problem with this treaty. None of the nuclear weapon states have signed on to it. And they've all indicated that they don't agree with it. And more than saying they don't agree with it, they've shown they don't agree with it by all of them launching very, very extensive programs to enhance their nuclear arsenals. Here in the United States, we are planning to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 3 decades to enhance every aspect of our nuclear arsenal. The land-based missiles, the submarine-based missiles, the bomber-based missiles. And we are sending to ourselves and to the world a very strong message that we intend to hold on to these weapons, that we do not intend to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or to honor our already existing obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which requires signatories like the United States to negotiate in good faith for the elimination of their nuclear arsenals, something which we are not doing. So the ball is now in our court. Those of us who live in the nuclear weapon states have to step up to the plate and force our government to change policy. Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Union of Concerned Scientists and Soko Gakkai International and a group of other faith and science-based organizations around the country are in the process right now of rolling out a campaign to change that. It's called Back from the Brink, a call to prevent nuclear war. And it is modeled very self-consciously on the Freeze campaign of the early 1980s, which organized itself around a simple prescription of what US nuclear policy should be. We should freeze the arms race. That was all the Freeze said. And it got people all around the country to endorse this dramatic change in US nuclear policy at the time. And that was the key organizing tool that the whole movement used to build opposition to the Cold War arms race. We formulated a similar prescription about what US nuclear policy should be. It's a little bit more complex. It has 5 elements, but it's pretty straightforward. The US should renounce the first use of nuclear weapons, should pledge never to use nuclear weapons first. Number 2, it should take our weapons off hair trigger alert. Number 3, it should end the sole unchecked authority of the President of the United States to launch nuclear war without congressional authority. Number 4, it should abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion modernizing its nuclear forces. And number 5, and perhaps most important, it should initiate and lead negotiations with the other 8 nuclear weapon states to establish an enforceable, verifiable, time-bound framework for actually dismantling the remaining nuclear weapons. It should fulfill the obligations which we have undertaken under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate the abolition of these weapons once and for all. This is a very ambitious agenda. The time frame for this campaign is 3 years. We don't expect to see major changes in nuclear policy under the current administration. We may be pleasantly surprised, but we don't feel that that is likely. We do believe that it is possible for a new administration to take office in January of 2021, which is committed to this nuclear policy, and which is staffed throughout in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the Energy Department, in the National Security Committee, all the relevant agencies staffed with people who are committed to this nuclear weapons policy. And again, it's a very ambitious goal, but we've done this once before. In the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, we completely changed US nuclear policy in 3 years' time. And so we're not setting ourselves an impossible task. We're simply saying that we need to do again what we've already done once before. And the mechanism is, as was the case with the Freeze campaign, to get people to sign on to this statement. And we are trying to get faith communities, labor unions, city governments, professional associations, civic groups, churches, any organization that comes together and functions as a community to endorse this nuclear policy. That's exactly what people did with the freeze. It worked then, and we believe it will work again. It should be a lot easier now because the freeze movement went viral at a time when the term didn't exist, when there was no internet and no social media. We understand that concept now, and we have the tools to take a message to the general population very quickly if we can figure out how to use them properly. And so that is our hope, that by getting first hundreds, which we've already done, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of organizations to sign on to this policy statement, we will effectively create a new national consensus that this is what the government must do. We've set up a website. It's www.preventnuclearwar.org. Prevent Nuclear War is one word. And you can go to the website, you can read the call to prevent nuclear war. You can see the names of the many other groups which have signed on already, and you can sign on your group. When your group has made a decision to do that, you can sign on as an individual and find out what you as an individual can do. But we're really trying to base this on organizations. We want people not to just act by themselves, but to reach out to the networks that they have, that already exist, and to mobilize those networks, and to get their communities to sign on to this. So this is some very heavy stuff we're talking about. I need to emphasize that I am not a pessimistic person. If I were, I would not be doing this. I truly believe that we can change the terrible situation that we're in and lead ourselves away from the danger that we face. But we all need to get to work if we're going to do that. I feel sometimes when I talk to people, especially people who don't know, younger people who may not have ever heard this kind of information before, that I've done something quite terrible to them. Because once you know about this, you really can't ignore the issue. And, if you see somebody fall down in front of you, you can't just step over them. If you know the whole planet is at risk, you can't not do something about it. And so once you know this information, there is a tremendous responsibility on your shoulders, and that is something of a burden. But I hope that we can all also look at this responsibility as a great gift. We all want to do something good with our lives. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to save the world. And that is the very best thing anyone can ever do in their lifetime. I think we need to view our current situation from that perspective. We have families we care about, we have children we love, we have grandchildren we love. We need to leave a world for them that is safe and secure, and we can do that. No one of us is going to do this by his or herself, but each one of us needs to do that part of the task which is ours to do. That's a Yiddish proverb. In Deuteronomy it says that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before us today. And so I think the task for each of us individually is to make sure that we choose wisely and that we act with determination and perseverance so that indeed our children can live. And I hope that we will all take up this task in that spirit. And if we do, I am very confident that we can, again, save the world. Thank you.